Come in from that cold. Don't linger on the threshold. The door needs closing firm or the wind finds its way through every crack in the frame. That's better. Here, shift yourself closer to the hearth. These stones have been holding heat since before your grandfather's time, and they'll warm you faster than any coat. Let me pour you something. This ale's been conditioning in the cellar since autumn. Dark as old leather and twice as fortifying. You'll need it. The story I'm about to tell you isn't the one you think you know. You'll have heard the name, I expect. Dick Turpin, the gentleman of the road, the dashing cavalier in his tricorn hat, riding Black Bess through the moonlight crying "Stand and deliver" with a pistol and a wink. The ballads paint him as something noble, don't they? A Robin Hood of the highways, redistributing wealth with a flourish and a bow. Forget all that. The man I'm going to tell you about wasn't a gentleman. He was a butcher, not in the poetic sense, in the literal blood on the apron sense. Richard Turpin learned his trade in a Whitechapel slaughterhouse, and he understood the cleaving of flesh and bone long before he ever sat a horse. When he moved from cattle to people, the principles will remain the same. Find the soft parts, apply pressure, extract what you need. This happened in Essex in the 1730s, when the county was still half wild. Picture it properly. Not the commuter towns you know today, but a landscape of deep ancient woodland, Epping, Hainault, rolling down into the marshes of the Thames estuary. The roads were mud tracks that turned to rivers in winter. The villages were scattered across miles of empty country, each farmhouse an island in the dark. And in that darkness, something had started hunting. They called themselves the Gregory Gang, though the locals had other names for them. The gang operated with the discipline of soldiers. Samuel Gregory led them. Him and his brothers Jasper and Jeremy, along with Joseph Rose, John Jones, Thomas Roden, and Turpin, the butcher's boy, who'd fled Whitechapel one step ahead of the rope for stealing livestock. They weren't highway robbers, not then. Highway robbery was almost gentlemanly by comparison. Quick, transactional, conducted in the open air. What the Gregory Gang did was worse. They invaded homes. Specifically, they targeted the isolated farmhouses where elderly folk lived with a lifetime savings hidden under floorboards or buried in the garden. Places where a scream wouldn't carry past the nearest hedge. The gang had learned something the authorities hadn't grasped yet. The medieval system of the hue and cry had collapsed. In theory, when a crime was committed, the victim raised the alarm, and every able man in the parish was legally bound to join the pursuit. In practice, against men like the Gregorys, that system was worth less than spit, because the gang didn't just rob. They sent messages. They made examples. The locals knew who they were, saw them drinking in the alehouses, wearing stolen coats, spending gold that had come from widows' mattresses. But nobody raised the hue. Nobody pursued, because everyone remembered what happened to those who didn't cooperate. The parish constable? He was a tradesman, a baker perhaps, or a carpenter, appointed for a year, unpaid, armed with nothing but a wooden staff and the fading authority of the crown. Against 7 armed men who'd learned their trade in the deer wars and perfected it in people's kitchens, he was about as useful as a candle in a gale. So the gang ruled, not through law, but through reputation, through the understanding that resistance had consequences that made cooperation look merciful. And the worst part, the thing that kept people awake at night, listening to every sound in the darkness. The gang didn't need to break in. People opened their doors to them. The gang had a system, you see, a code wrapped inside ordinary conversation, the kind that could be spoken in a tap room full of witnesses without anyone understanding what was actually being arranged. Turpin would be in the alehouse, the boozing Ken in their language, watching, always watching. And when a wealthy traveller arrived, someone who'd paid for their meal in gold rather than copper, someone whose horse was worth more than a labourer earned in a year, Turpin would lean close to one of the Gregory brothers and murmur, "There's a fat pig to be had if you want one." The reply would come back, casual as discussing the weather. "I pray you put him in the hogsty till tomorrow." That was it. A death sentence delivered in 6 words that sounded like farm business. But it wasn't travellers who suffered the worst. It was the ones who couldn't flee. The elderly, living alone in those scattered farmhouses. Their servants gone home for the night. Just themselves and the fire and whatever wealth they'd managed to scrape together over a lifetime of work. February 1735. Loughton. The Widow Shelley heard the knock at her door just as full dark settled in. Perhaps she thought it was a neighbour. Perhaps she was simply too polite, too conditioned by a lifetime of hospitality to refuse. They came in fast. 7 men, faces blackened with soot like the old poaching gangs, moving with the efficiency of those who'd done this before. They secured the exits first. Then they began asking questions. Where was the money? Where were the valuables? The widow refused to answer, stubborn perhaps. Or perhaps she simply didn't believe they'd actually do what they threatened. She was wrong about that. They didn't beat her, not at first. Instead, they lifted her, a woman in her 70s, light as kindling, and they held her over her own fire, the hearth where she'd cooked her meals, warmed her hands, lived her life. They held her there while the heat rose and her clothes began to smoke. She told them where the money was. That became their signature. The domestic turned weapon, your own home used against you. The psychology of it was exquisite in its cruelty. They weren't just robbing you, they were making you complicit in your own violation, making you beg them to take everything just to make it stop. Joseph Lawrence, a farmer in Edgware, learned this lesson when the gang visited him. 70 years old, a man who'd worked that land his entire life. When he wouldn't talk, Turpin beat him with the butt of a pistol. A barker, they called it. When that didn't work, they brought a kettle from his own stove and poured boiling water over his head. The skin blistered instantly, peeling away like wet paper. Still wouldn't talk. So they dragged him by his nose around the house and sat him bare-bottomed directly on the fire grate. He talked then. They all talked eventually. The gang took his life savings and left him there scalded and burned, too broken to even call for help. His servants found him hours later, still sitting where they'd left him, whimpering. For nearly 2 years, this was the reality in Essex. The gang moved through the county like a plague. They robbed the Loughton farmer. They tortured the barking widow. They left a trail of burned and broken people, and the silence around them grew heavier, because everyone knew that to speak was to become the next lesson, the next message. The authorities raised the reward, £10, 20, 50, eventually £100, more money than most men would see in a lifetime. But still, the silence held. The gang had demonstrated something fundamental. They could reach you. They knew where you lived, and walls meant nothing to them. Then, in 1735, the net finally closed, not because of bravery or brilliant detective work, but because the sheer scale of the violence had become intolerable. Several of the gang were caught, tried, and hanged. Samuel Gregory went to the nubbing cheat, the gallows, and was left to swing in chains near the scenes of his crimes, his body rotting in its cage as a warning to others. Turpin saw which way the wind was blowing and did what he'd always done best. He ran. He vanished into Epping Forest, that dense tangle of oak and hornbeam where the canopy blocked out the sky, and the paths were known only to poachers and outlaws. He reinvented himself. No more housebreaking. That required a team, required fences and safe houses. He became what the Ballads would later celebrate, a highwayman. But he wasn't alone. He partnered with a man named Tom King, and together they worked the roads around London. They lived rough, hiding in caves and watching the turnpikes like wolves watching a flock. The partnership didn't last. May 1737. The constables caught up with them in Whitechapel. There was a scuffle. King was grabbed. Turpin, seeing his partner held, drew his pistol and fired. He missed the constable completely. He shot Tom King instead, straight through the body. The wound was fatal, and King died knowing that his own partner had killed him. Whether through incompetence or calculation, we'll never know. What we do know is that in his final moments, King talked, gave up information, broke the code they called game. Turpin didn't stay to see him die. He was already running. The killing of Tom King was a blunder. What came next was murder in cold blood. Thomas Morris was a servant to one of the forest keepers. He was nobody important, just a working man doing his job, checking the woodland near Epping. He spotted Turpin hiding in the undergrowth and approached. Perhaps he thought he could talk to him. Perhaps he simply didn't realize who he was looking at. Turpin raised his carbine and shot him dead at close range. That changed everything. Morris wasn't a criminal who'd broken the code. He wasn't a rival. He was an innocent man, a servant, someone's son or brother or husband. The authorities raised the reward to £200 and offered the king's pardon to anyone who turned Turpin in. The whole county was looking for him now, so Turpin did what any sensible murderer would do. He crossed the Humber and disappeared into Yorkshire, settling in the village of Brew under the name John Palmer. For nearly 2 years, he played the part of a respectable horse dealer. He hunted with the local gentry. He drank in the inns. He sold horses he'd acquired during trips south, and nobody questioned where a man with no visible trade got such fine animals. He'd escaped. He'd won. Then, on October 2nd, 1738, he saw a neighbour's rooster scratching in the street. For no reason, pure spite or boredom, or the arrogance of a man who thought he was untouchable. He raised his gun and shot the bird dead. The owner, a man named Hall, confronted him. In a civilized village, you'd apologize, perhaps offer payment. Turpin's response was to threaten to shoot Hall too, if he didn't shut his bone box, his mouth. Hall complained to the parish authorities. John Palmer was arrested for disturbing the peace and committed to the House of Correction when he couldn't find anyone to vouch for his character. From his cell, desperate to prove he was respectable, Turpin wrote to his brother-in-law in Essex, asking for a character reference. The letter required the recipient to pay the postage, 6pence. When it arrived, the brother-in-law looked at it, saw it was from a troublesome relative, and refused to accept it. The letter was returned to Saffron Walden. There, a man named James Smith saw the handwriting on the rejected envelope. Smith had been a schoolmaster in Hempstead years earlier. He taught a young Dick Turpin to write. He recognized the script immediately. Within days, John Palmer was identified. Within weeks, he was transferred to York Castle in chains. The trial at the York Assizes took less than a day. He was convicted of horse theft, a hanging offence, and sentenced to death. On April 7, 1739, Turpin made his final performance. He'd bought new shoes and a fine frock coat for the occasion. He hired 5 professional mourners to walk behind the cart, paying them 10 shillings each. As he rode through the streets of York to the Knave's Mire, he bowed to the jeering crowds as if they were admirers at a theatre. At the gallows, he spoke with the hangman for half an hour, finally confessing to the robberies and the murder of Morris. Then, as his right leg began to tremble, the only sign of the terror he must have felt, he stamped it down violently, and before the hangman could turn him off, he threw himself from the ladder. He died as he'd lived, violently, publicly, desperately trying to control the narrative even as the rope tightened. That night, body snatchers tried to steal his corpse to sell to the surgeons, but the mob, the same crowd that had jeered him to his death, rescued the body and reburied it in quicklime, dissolving what remained of Dick Turpin before the resurrection men could profit from it. The fires burned down to embers now, glowing like eyes in the ash. Your glass is empty, and the wind outside has settled to a whisper. Here's to the myths we tell ourselves, to the legends that smooth away the blood and the screams and leave us with nothing but a man on a horse and a romantic highway. Here's to remembering that behind every ballad is a reality far darker and far more human than the song admits. And here's to the Widow Shelley and Joseph Lawrence and Thomas Morris and all the nameless others whose suffering got edited out of the story so we could have our dashing highwayman. Dick Turpin wasn't a hero. He was a thug who roasted old women over their own fires and shot his partner in the back. The only thing remarkable about him was how thoroughly we've chosen to forget what he actually was. Now off with you. The road's dark, but you'll be safe enough. The highwaymen are long gone, hanged and buried and turned to dust. What remains are the stories, and the stories, as you've just heard, are worth getting right. Mind how you go. And if you ever find yourself tempted to romanticize the past, to imagine that cruelty was somehow more noble when it wore a tricorn hat and rode a black horse, remember this. The past smelled of burned flesh and boiling water. It sounded like old women screaming. And it ended, as it always does, at the end of a rope. Some men deserve to be forgotten, but their victims deserve to be remembered. Safe travels. You've been listening to British Pub Law. Mind how you go.